Alright, y'all, so today I wanted to do a very quick review of, well, I guess you can consider this the first definitive version of The Lord of the Rings, Ralph Bakshi's 1978 version, The Lord of the Rings. So to get into this review, of course, I'm going to give you my pros, my cons, and my overall thoughts. Now, my experience with the Lord of the Rings trilogy is mostly from the Peter Jackson trilogy. I've never read the books, so take that into consideration. I've really only seen the Jackson movies, and I've also kind of studied up on the lore a little bit. But beyond that, that's really my sort of experience with the Lord of the Rings franchise. Now, over the years, I had no clue this movie was a thing until I eventually found out about it due to the poster and my familiarity with Ralph Bakshi. Now, I have heard of this guy. He is kind of one of the big pioneers in animation. He was really one of the first guys to make animation more adult, I guess in a way more mainstream. I mean, he broke a lot of barriers, right? And if you're a fan of animation, you've probably heard of this guy. He did films like Felix the Cat, that pretty crazy movie. He also did some other movies like what's that one called? Cool City, if you remember that one. I remember him specifically for the wild and crazy film that is Coonskin. Probably his most provocative film to date. It's a pretty crazy movie. It has a lot of commentary on stereotypes and racism at the time the movie was made in America. And I heard a little bit that he did an adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, but I didn't really think too much into it until I finally got around to watching it. Now, I also understand too, like before the Jackson trilogy, a lot of people did grow up on this movie, and I've kind of seen some reviews of it being bad, some reviews of it praising it, like especially with a lot of people who watched it and this was like their first experience with Lord of the Rings. I totally get the praise for this movie. Now, taking all that into consideration, my thoughts on Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings. I think overall it's pretty decent. If not, it's good. I didn't come out of this thing hating it. I didn't come out of this thing thinking like, oh, it was the worst adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. I actually liked it a little bit more than I was expecting to. That being said, there is a lot of problems, and right off the gate, I'm just going to tell y'all, even though I haven't seen the Jackson trilogy in a very long time, yeah, the Jackson trilogy is way better than this. But that being said, I'm going to get into my pros, my cons, and my overall thoughts on this movie. So going into this, let's get into the pros. I think, what's very interesting about this movie is number one, it's pretty long. It's like about over 2 hours, which at the time for animation was a huge deal. I think this was the longest animated movie ever made for a while. And I think it, for the most part, is a pretty good story. It has some very interesting versions of the classic Lord of the Rings characters. It tells the story of two of the books, Fellowship of the Ring, and the second book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Now, famously, this movie is technically only a part one. They actually never got around to finishing and doing Return of the King and stuff, which honestly, as much as maybe some of the disdain for this movie is over the years, I think it's a bit of a shame we never got to see the conclusion of this. Even though they did make Return of the King technically, but it was from a different company and technically not in the same continuity as this one. That being said, I think a lot of the versions of the characters here are pretty cool. You can also see a lot of influence on the Jackson movie here. There's some scenes actually very similar to the Jackson movie. Like there's one scene where the hobbits are hiding from the Black Riders, and that's like the same shot from the Jackson movie. So it's pretty cool that some influence came from this, and there's a lot of really cool and interesting stuff done here. And I like some of the characterizations of characters. For example, I like the hobbits. Frodo's pretty cool. Sam's pretty cool. Even though there are some pretty radically different designs here, I think it was pretty cool how they were adapted. I like Gandalf here. He's pretty cool. Aragorn is pretty cool here. The other characters that I would feel like the Jackson movie does give a little bit of a shine on, I think the movie kind of forgets and they're just kind of in the background. They're kind of here just because, well, they're in the book. And there's also some frankly bizarre and wild choices in design in animation. Now, this movie was pretty innovative at the time. It, like a lot of Ralph Bakshi movies, incorporated live action elements. For example, he would use basically this movie, as far as I understand it, it was made two times. Ralph Bakshi shot a lot of footage with actors, especially for the battle scenes, guys in sort of costumes and stuff in Spain. And then, he would animate it all and rotoscope it, which was used to save money and on the budget and sort of, animate it and do it in a unique style. And I think parts of it do work. It gives some points in the movie a very nice human-like quality and fluidity to it all. There's some really good scenes where characters are talking to each other and how they're moving and expressing themselves. Feels very natural. It feels like almost like those early Disney movies. But I'll get into my cons later. Sometimes, like I said, to really describe the animation here, I guess the one term I can describe it is it's very much inconsistent. Like, there's some really good animated sequences, and I mean, it's a very watchable movie. It's not like, it's a very hard movie to watch, but like I said, it's just inconsistent in terms of quality. Like also other things, I think Ralph Bakshi adapted this pretty well. You have to remember this was way before the Jackson trilogy. No one had really done a serious attempt of the Lord of the Rings before. And I think, for the most part, he did it pretty well. And I think he also established the look of these characters way before Jackson did it. The hobbits look cool. The world is pretty decently established, even though there are many scenes that give like tons of exposition and stilted dialogue, which I'll get into my cons. But I think, for the most part, even though I've never read the Lord of the Rings books personally, I could follow the story pretty decently. Now, I do think that I already have seen the previous movies, so I think that helped. But I think I have to appreciate Ralph Bakshi's attempts here. There's a lot of really good scenes. Some, exposition and world-building stuff is decently explained for an audience. I still think, while not all the stuff in this people will understand, I think it's still a decent way to experience Lord of the Rings. And I have to give Ralph Bakshi credit. There's a lot of really cool stuff that was established here and no one had really done before, and he does some scenes very decently. The designs of characters, like I mentioned, are pretty solid for the most part. There's some like really weird ones, but for adaptation-wise, I think it has more of a hit than misses. And then in terms of the story, I mean, it's Lord of the Rings. It's one of the coolest fantasy book trilogies of all time, fantasy stories. I love the Lord of the Rings stories, and I obviously think, even though there's some bias in the fact that, Jackson adapted it first, I think it's really cool, and I think it was pretty decently adapted here. There's some pretty cool sequences. Some parts of the animation, especially with the fight scenes, are pretty cool. I think my favorite scenes are when the characters banter and talk and converse among themselves. I think it's where the animation, especially the rotoscoping and how the rotoscoping on the actors' expressions also really works. So that's a big pro of this movie. And, in terms of story, I think it's decently explained. I mean, it is the Lord of the Rings, so I don't really have too many complaints about the story. I've always really liked the story. It's decently adapted here. There's a few details here and there that they could have, adapted and maybe expanded upon. But then again, like I said, this is an animated film, and obviously animated films take a lot of time and money and stuff. Obviously, they can't put everything into one movie, but still, like I said, it's decent. I also thought most of the voice actors do a really good job as well. Some of their dialogue's pretty stilted. I think for what they were given, they do a good job. They do a pretty damn good job. I especially, like I mentioned, I really like the voice of Gandalf. Pretty cool. You can definitely see the influence on like actors like Ian McKellen, who would do Gandalf years later in the Jackson movies. So that's all pretty cool stuff. And there's just, like I said before, some really good sequences. Now let's get into some of my cons. Now, this is a part one, and I really do think this movie should have been called a part one because it just kind of ends on a very random cliffhanger. Because this, I believe, adapts the first book, and I think most of the second book, enough half of it. And I gotta be honest here, the ending is pretty anticlimactic. Now, I'm not exactly blaming Ralph Bakshi here. Apparently, the studio didn't want to put a part one or a to be continued because they felt like people were going to pay for like a part one of an experience, which I think is a bit of a ridiculous notion, especially in an industry where, there's always been sequels and movies and stuff that have always been to be continued. But that's what they're, like I said, the studio who helped finance this movie, United Artists, thought. And I think that really hurts the movie. There's a very vague ending at the end. Like, the movie just kind of ends very abruptly, and there's no satisfaction or conclusion, which is really frustrating, and especially makes it even more frustrating, of course, the fact that Ralph Bakshi, and for whatever reasons, never got around to making a sequel. So that's kind of a big con. Like I said, I wish they would have made a sequel. And now I'm going to talk about some of the character designs. I like designs like Gandalf, Aragorn, probably pronouncing them names wrong, but there are some designs, I'm going to be frank here, that don't look great. For example, Legolas. He's obviously the elf character in the Lord of the Rings. I'm probably saying his name wrong, but who cares? I don't know what they were doing with his design, bro. He looks very white, and I don't think that looks like a good color for him because I've always kind of figured elves are more greenish in appearance. Not like skin tone, but their outfits. And they have some of the weirdest eyes they added on him. I don't think he was adapted really well at all. Also, I think the actors, too, that are portraying their live-action counterparts, sometimes they work, but sometimes the movie has a tendency for these actors to overexpress themselves. And like I said, there's a lot of really uncanny and almost cringe moments in this movie. I was, like I said before, there's some really weird scenes. Like Gandalf, for example, he's adapted pretty well here, and he looks fine. But there's some weird faces he makes, which I have to, like I said, chalk it up to the rotoscoping. Like I said, the rotoscoping makes for more fluidity in terms of animations and movement, but at the same time I think it's a little bit of a mixed blessing because sometimes it works and sometimes it looks really uncanny and not great. That's why I said earlier it's kind of inconsistent. And to kind of go back to my earlier point, Gandalf the actor points at everything and overexpresses himself, and I don't know, it's just like I said, I think that's just the actor who is being animated is I'm not saying anything. I must overexpress myself and point at everything. And it's just like I said, that's not natural. Most people don't overly point or do anything crazy like that unless they're probably on something or I don't know. It just didn't feel natural. And of course, like I said, with the rotoscoping, and this goes for a lot of the characters, there are some weird faces, there's some weird goofy moments, there's even some infamous moments in this scene. Also, the movie kind of switches back and forth in terms of the rotoscoping. Sometimes, like I said, it's clearly rotoscoped over someone, but it's done and they're kind of covered in traditional animation, right? And it looks good. And then there's some characters and factions that are clearly just actors, and they're kind of just rotoscoped in, changed a little bit on the lighting, like the images and the cells are really darkened, but they're clearly live-action actors and elements thrown into this world. Now, Bakshi's done this with some of his films, especially with integrating live-action animation, like in Coonskin, which I think looked a little bit better, but I think here, it became more mixed. I think even Bakshi said it later. They would rotoscope and, basically use that as a reference instead of actually covering it with animation and stuff. And I think it creates very uneven results because you can tell the guys, for example, the orcs in this movie look kind of cheap and bizarre. You can tell they're wearing mock costumes and fake gloves and fake mask and stuff. They kind of like I said, they do kind of get away with it at some points because they're, the image of them and the way they're rotoscoped and put into the scene. I'm probably getting some of these technical terms wrong, but the way they're put into the scenes, they're heavily darkened, so you can't exactly tell always. I guess that was done to hide the imperfections. But it's just like I said, it just creates a pretty, bizarre contrast between, the traditional animation that's being rotoscoped and then these guys that have been changed a little bit and put into these animated backgrounds. It just kind of creates a very uneven experience. I kind of wish the orcs were done as more of a traditional animation, I guess, like Frodo and Aragorn and the main characters. Maybe, like I said, this was a thing that you just didn't have the budget for and it was cheaper. But it just, like I said, I think for me, it destroys a little bit of the immersion. And there's some points, too, where even the main characters are fighting orcs and stuff. And they kind of switch to this, like you can tell it's an actor wearing fake costumes, not the rotoscoped put on top animation doing the action. And it kind of, like I said before, like I said earlier, it creates inconsistency. But like I said, I don't hate it. You can arguably look at it. It's a very interesting style choice. I mean, this movie, if anything else, has a lot of really interesting animation techniques. It has a lot of very interesting flair and style to it. But like I said, I think some of the results don't work as well as others, right? I think the orcs are probably the biggest example. I really wish the orcs were done as traditional animation. So yeah, like I said, those kind of problems make for a very weird viewing experience in parts. I also think the action, while in parts decently well done, some of it doesn't hold a candle obviously to the Jackson movies. The Battle of Helm's Deep is not horrible, but it's kind of like it's just obviously not as big and as grand as the Jackson movies. And I know I'm saying that a lot in this review, but I did think the final battle was a little bit underwhelming. But like I said, not horrible. And there's a lot of really good stuff. Like in the Jackson movie, the orcs do try to put up ladders and try to get to the walls of Helm's Deep. Really cool stuff. They even get a battery ram. It's just, I think the rotoscoping and the fact that, like I said, you can tell they're all live action actors kind of, modified and put into an animated background looks a little bit strange for me, and it doesn't always translate well and looks that great. I also think, too, like the story itself also has a lot of exposition and stilted dialogue. The intro, for example, gives all this really crazy exposition about the rings and Bilbo Baggins and stuff, and it's all designed to catch up the audience, and it's okay. Like I said, it's an okay opening to the movie. I did wish, though, like the Jackson movie, they incorporated this bit better, maybe explained it with dialogue from characters and more naturally in the story. Like, I know it's a broken record, but the Jackson movie, they did that a little bit better. I felt like the writing was a bit better there. And like I said, it just kind of, that part of it, I think the stilted dialogue is not exactly the fault of the actors. I think the animation and the script is a little bit stilted. But, regardless, I think personally, I think overall, it doesn't create for a great experience. But, like I said, regardless, to kind of go back in some of my pros, I think a lot of the animation looks good. The worlds, the locations look cool. I think, Jackson was totally inspired by this movie, and I have to appreciate Ralph Bakshi attempting to do it first. I just think that it kind of came out with some uneven results and some pretty weird scenes. Some scenes are really good and the story is done pretty decently, but there's some parts where I like the animation's really uneven, the rotoscoping, the live action elements especially, putting into the movie just look really strange and bizarre and out of place. And there's just like some of the rotoscoping animation put on top of actors' performances looks good, and some of it looks uncanny and bizarre. I also think there's a lot of sequences, obviously, in the books and in the future movies that was done better. I think for me, maybe one of the worst scenes in the movie is which ironically in the Jackson movie is one of the most epic ones. Is when Gandalf fights the giant. I think it was the creature Balrog. Now it's a bit unvague in the book, like if he has wings. I mean, I'm not gonna get into the whole debate, but you can tell it's some big guy in a suit, and just Gandalf kind of just throws his staff down, and then they all break, and then a whip, like because in this version he has a whip, and he kind of drags Gandalf down. Which very interesting enough, there was a deleted scene from this movie decades later that I think Ralph shared that actually Balrog looks way better. He looks like a traditional animated creature. Like it's kind of bizarre. It's like it looks better than the final movie. That's why I've always felt like the live action elements, the rotoscoping, the fact you can tell they just kind of put these actors in and just kind of changed a few things. I think just kind of, in my opinion, doesn't work as well. I think it just, like I said, there should have been more animated characters with traditional animation put in. But that's just my opinion. I'm not an animation expert. But like I said, the scene with the Balrog, it's one of the most really underwhelming and disappointing parts of the movie. Doesn't hold a candle to the whole scene in the Jackson movie where Gandalf yells, you shall not pass. I mean, amazing sequence. Iconic. And I get it, like I said, this was the 1970s. They didn't have the budget, but I still wanted to mention it. But regardless, I'm probably going on too many tangents. Ralph Bakshi's The Lord of the Rings is an incomplete movie. It never got the chance to finish its story. It tried to be very innovative with a lot of new techniques, and I think in a lot of ways established a really cool framework for what someone in the future could do with Lord of the Rings better. And I mean, really, he was the first guy to do it. I know there were some plays, and it technically wasn't the first adaptation, but it was really the first serious one. And I have to appreciate that. I have to appreciate the pioneers, and I think this movie is still pretty decent. It's not that bad. I think it has a decent story. I mean, obviously, The Lord of the Rings is a great story, and it adapts it decently in a lot of parts. I just think that it lacks the charm. There's a lot of stilted dialogue, a lot of unnecessary exposition that could have been told in the movie. And obviously the biggest sin of it, which really isn't the fault of the filmmakers, is it's an incomplete story. The movie just kind of randomly ends, and it's one of the most rushed and kind of weird endings of all time. And it's a bit of a shame they never got the chance to finish it. The rotoscoping animation, like I said before, the biggest term I use, is very inconsistent. Some parts it works and it creates, some really fluid and natural expressions and animation on the characters. And in some parts, it just creates some very dopey, uncanny stuff. And especially when they introduce the live action stuff, it gets, for me, a little bit of a mixed bag. But, like I said, this movie has a lot of style, has a lot of flair. There's a lot of still really good stuff in this movie. And I overall didn't have a horrible viewing experience. I also totally get if people love this movie. For a lot of people, you have to remember this was, for a lot of people before the Jackson movies, a whole generation watched this and love it. So, like I said, totally respect that. If you love this movie, totally let me know. But yeah, overall, for my kind of quickly wrap this up, Ralph Bakshi's The Lord of the Rings, it's a pretty decent movie. It has a lot of flaws, a lot of inconsistency. The biggest key word here is just it's very inconsistent. It's a mixed bag overall, but not a horrible experience. I wouldn't say too, I think it would be unfair to not forget. I think it would be very unfair to it too to forget it. I think absolutely people should remember this and just, view it for what it is, as an important chapter of the Tolkien legacy and adaptations of Lord of the Rings. But yeah, overall, it's a decent movie. So yeah, that's my review of Ralph Bakshi's The Lord of the Rings that came out in 1978. Hopefully you all have a good day and peace, y'all.